So all day today, you guys have been sending me Justin's video from Nerdslayer Studios, A Death of a Game, New World. And so this is going to be my reaction to it. But because this is a reaction video and because of how reaction videos are in this weird gray area, besides me just hoping that you go and click the link in the description and check out his video, I'm going to be donating half of any of this revenue that this video generates to Justin through either his YouTube studio or his Twitch. Whatever way, I'm going to manually revenue share this video with him if this video gets any revenue whatsoever. Generally speaking, reaction videos do way better than normal everyday content. In fact, I just posted a video about that today. So that's going to be my general policy going forward. I'm going to be doing reaction videos. Occasionally, I'll bring that back on the channel because the growth in and of itself is just too much as a content creator to pass up. And while that shouldn't be the be all end all driving factor, that is a reality that I think all content creators have to be aware of. So please also, if you get a chance, check out that original video. It's very insightful. And hopefully we can get to a point where YouTube actually does all the work on the back end in terms of both revenue share and also watch time share and things like that. So hopefully we could see a better future for reaction content here on YouTube, but that's just gonna be my personal policy going forward. I wanted to share that with you guys at the start of this video so that way you guys have the information. And I'm gonna beg you guys also to check out the original video. That's gonna help it out in the algorithm. Generally speaking, we see about a 1 to 5% kind of click-through ratio overall, so maybe we could beat that. I'd love to see a 50% click-through ratio, especially when it comes to these specific videos. Thanks guys for that introduction, and let's go ahead and dive in to Death of a Game.
Sometimes, despite signs of life, a game is far more dead than we realize. In moments like that, I have to be willing to stake my name on what I believe to be a certain future for the game in question. New World is a game I have a personal history with, being an alpha tester who even stepped foot into their game studios. So no matter how this comes across, you can trust it's from a person with a perspective on the whole thing.
So, and to kind of highlight that, because we've had, like I said, we've talked with Justin multiple times on the podcast, and I even said how long until New World gets a Death of the Game, and he talked about obviously a massive population drop. Overall, like when you look at what New World is, I'm gonna wonder if I'm gonna be surprised by anything he shares based off of the kind of games that he has gone through. Now he's been working with the devs as a part of kind of the alpha beta process, and so he's had special insight into the game's development for a long time. So I wonder what he'll be able to.
New World, developed by Amazon Game Studios and published by Amazon, is an MMORPG survival-style action game that launched back in September of 2021. New World initially would wow the internet with impressive visuals and sounds, having an impressive near million-person peak player count on Steam, before plummeting in only a few months, down 90% of its player base. Why was New World unable to sustain its massive initial successes? And why am I featuring it on the series before it's technically dead yet, besides that not being the only requirement to make the series? Well, detectives and those new to the channel, you will have to wait to find out more, as we will uncover the biggest clues and present our evidence at the very end of the episode for the final deduction concerning the largest contributing factors for the death of a game, New World.
So as I jump in here, because this is a reaction content, this is what we do. We make it a discussion based. All in all, when it talks about 90%, that's always referring to the concurrent users, which generally is usually you take that, you multiply it by anywhere from 7 to 11 in terms of its multiplier factor for actually getting kind of a monthly active user base. You can also look at the time amount played when it comes to these MMOs. So generally speaking, that is essentially kind of the story being told. All in all, do they lose 90%? Probably, like, because as it relates to, like, you can take that 7 to 11 times the 900, etc., and get a good rough estimate about how many people were actually playing the game or how many people actually bought it. It anywhere as kind of were from probably like 15 to 25 million units sold, which actually is really generally quite impressive. But the question for me has always been, how does New World invite players back in? And that is part of three key factors: content, consistency, and communication. I believe to this point where as long as Amazon follows through on that, continues to develop the game, and I think honestly an expansion ends up being kind of a real key moment of building out player trust in them, in who they are as a studio. I think essentially you'll see New World continue to fight itself back. It's the same model that all other current successful MMOs that have struggled all really out of the box and have had massive losses right away, because that generally speaks to be kind of how MMOs function. Anyway, we'll continue on.
Stay tuned to the very end of the episode to catch a hint on what the next episode might be.
Ooh. Oh man, I love that intro. That's awesome. Good editing, Tom. Oh, that's good.
Hello everybody, I'd like to welcome our sponsor for this video. It's Geologie. Geologie is a 9-time award-winning men's skincare product recognized in the Men's Health, Esquire, and Ask Men Grooming Awards. With 5,000 plus 5-star reviews, Geologie creates a simple, effective skincare routine customized just for you. You just click the link provided and fill out a 30-second diagnostic quiz. In just a few clicks, you tell them about your skin goals, and then a team of dermatologists will design a regimen just for you to be shipped directly to your door. It's that simple. This skincare routine helps you fight acne, reduce oiliness, prevent wrinkles, combat dark or puffy under eyes. As somebody with chronic dark under eyes, Geologie Galaxy community for more daily tips, giveaways, and more at discord.gg/geologie. Thanks again to Geologie for sponsoring today's video, and back to the mystery detectives. Amazon Game Studios, which is where the story begins, was formed back in 2012. When Amazon bought action shooter developer Double Helix 2 years later in 2014, they got a head start. Double Helix was founded back in 2007 and had mostly forgettable titles like Battleship and Silent Hill Homecoming, but managed something half decent with Killer Instinct back in 2013.
I love that game.
Double Helix would form the backbone of Amazon Game Studios. Amazon had only ever sold games as a distributor, but had expressed more interest in creating their own video game developer in-house, which explained the AGS initiative. AGS, or Amazon Game Studios, initially would create mobile games and otherwise not so noteworthy titles. But that's not Amazon enough, surely. September of 2016, and Amazon would announce not just one, but 3 major titles, including one we have already covered on the series, Crucible, and one that we are covering on this episode, New World. New World was set to be a sandbox survival MMO based on the colonization of the Americas with a supernatural twist. New World was described as allowing players to choose between playing as a farmer, a crafter, or an adventurer, as well as focus on building camps and towns to survive the harsh environment. Even the journalist describing the game in their article likened it to Rust, or an Ark-type MMO, with colonialism thrown in there. Whatever you were likening it to, an MMORPG is one of the most complex genres, and Amazon was signing up right at the top. Amazon being willing to jump right into the field might be super exciting, but no matter how much money they would put in, if they didn't understand how an MMORPG works, then it would be mostly for naught. We've seen this happen time and time again on the series, with big players entering the online space, only to leave with their tail between their legs.
Even with other big players, especially in the MMO space, generally speaking, the majority of them had nostalgia. They had an established IP that the game itself was already based on. I'm sure there's obviously exceptions that we can talk about here, but if you start to think about an MMO RPG, what stands out the most to you? Is it a brand new, never heard of, not based off of anything you've ever played before game? Or is it something that is just, like, hey, that exactly is what I've been playing? Final Fantasy, Star Wars, Elder Scrolls, and on and on. The video and footage here is the Warhammer, in that regard. So there is a huge connection and nostalgia that kind of bleeds well into an MMO. An MMO without having any foundational nostalgic base can struggle, because you could actually say that nostalgia can end up helping fill the gaps as players wait for more content. Now, that trust might not be fulfilled. It might be fulfilled in the grand scheme of things, but all in all, when it comes down to it, I think that there's definitely a point that absolutely has to be had, and something that works against New World is that people haven't played the standalone New World RPG and couldn't wait to explore this game and this world and the story as it evolves with their friends. I mean, for case in point, the best example out of all of them, didn't list it, was World of Warcraft.
There were next to no details concerning New World for the next 2 years following the announcement, as typically expected of an MMO that can sometimes have a development cycle of 5 years. Instead, one of the 3 announced titles was already being shuttered. Breakaway, which I managed to also alpha test and never let people forget about it because it was their earliest failure, them being AGS, was being shut down before it even launched back in March of 2018. This apparently would now bring more focus to the other two titles, Crucible, and relevant for our story, New World. June 15th, 2018 is when I personally enter the story, and while there's not always an inside scoop on the Death of a Game series, on special occasions like this we get a view from the inside from your trusty, local neighborhood detective. AGS would contact a few of us streamers or YouTubers, and mostly guys who played survival games and a couple MMO players, and have us fly out to their studios in Irvine, California. Not only would we become alpha testers, we were some of the earliest and highest profile testers stepping foot into the test studio that, by the way, used to be a Breakaway esports room for our 4-hour-long sessions that we took. That version of New World was far more raw than what people were probably used to or exposed to. You didn't have set cities, instead you had building, and you could build freeform-wise like a true survival game. There was next to no lore in the game, and there was barely any points of interest. On top of that, it utilized a criminal system where you could flag and then kill another player and take their dropped stuff. At this point, I already recognized that New World's team was utilizing an outdated criminal system, and because of this, the system would probably be easily exploited. I tried to
Oh man, and was it ever? When it comes down to it, like full loot, open world PvP, like I see how there's definitely a community that wants that kind of game, and when they shifted off that, we saw a massive kickback, a massive reaction, a lot of frustration people had towards it. But when it comes down to it, I guess from their numbers and what they were looking at, it clearly was like people aren't having fun. They're just trying to play the game. In fact, when I was talking and following New World during that time and talking about it, people were like, oh, it's that kind of PvP game. I'm going to pass. I don't need that kind of stress in my life. And that's maybe, maybe there's definitely a game that can kind of do that, deliver that for everybody. I'd love to see what that would look like in the long run. If, like we could always, I'm not going to sit here and say that it's for an era that has passed and can never come back. But I think essentially when we look at technology, there's a couple of things that definitely need to be added overall to kind of re-attract that kind of player. But anyway, you can always let me know.
Show this to developers by running around and PKing the other content creators on repeat, and in my feedback I also made sure to mention that it was a problem. If you study other MMORPGs of the past, you should know that you can't trust players to make good decisions without building a system to facilitate such.
That's
if
true.
you have a criminal system with no nuance other than being flagged or not, inevitably people will abuse such a simple system. It's frustrating because people think it's indicative of a PvP-focused game just being destined for failure, but in my opinion it has more to do with the fact that the criminal system itself, like other systems presented in New World sadly, by 2018 was already outdated by easily 15 years. Other things mentioned for feedback for New World by content creators were more lore and just reasons to care about the world in general. Sure, it was a sandbox, but there still needed to be more in that sandbox to make people care about building in said sandbox.
Absolutely.
We also echoed in unison that we enjoyed the Dark Souls combat approach that was more prevalent early on in the game, and felt like New World should lean more into that, as well as take inspiration in the dangerous world that we were discovering, which felt at the moment pretty empty and lifeless, but could have a certain Dark Souls element to it that would be pretty enjoyable. It felt like all in all it was a really productive feedback session. How much they took in the end, of course, we don't really know, but we did sit in front of pretty much the major developers on the project and sat up individually and gave our piece. Sometime near the end of 2019, New World would shift the game to a buy-to-play business model pre-launch from a free-to-play one. There's a bit of speculation as to why this is, such as lack of faith in the product, and I don't think that it's ever been properly addressed, but AGS would allow the early backers of the game at least to get it for free. Nearly 2 years after I reported the issue to New World devs when testing their game, they would finally respond to the criticism and rampant PK issues in their game, January 2020, by shifting the game completely away from PvP altogether by straight removing the criminal system. This was
Oh man, and I know he's probably going to address it here, but oh my gosh, like reading the Reddits and the forums and just the frustration that players had, because that's what they were wanting, that's what they were supporting, that's what they kind of signed up for in terms of that faith in which that, hey, this is going to be something that to get the game coming. Now, as far as the shift from a free to play to a buy to play, personally, I actually completely support that. I think buy to play is the future of especially MMOs, and even going into the pre-launch of this game, the rampant fears that people were presenting over like, you know, like just bad monetization and how this game was going to be such this like, you know, this cash shop sucker, you know, gotcha game, when then at the end of the day, like then you have Lost Ark coming out and just saying like, oh, you want that, that's what you want, here, well then here you go. And Lost Ark just absolutely crushing it in terms of just like revenue players and bots, and bots too.
Seen as a solution to some players, and while in some ways it was more of a band-aid fix. Instead of fleshing out the criminal system and attempting to add like karma to it and fix it, they just removed the whole thing. But it's not a real solution because New World was primarily built on conflict, through creating bases in places you live and operate out of and then fighting over these. That was kind of the point of New World. It lacked any real storytelling and even basic questing. It felt like the AGS team, with the PvP changes, were just taking their ball and going home. This meant that AGS a year before launch was going to drastically switch the focus of New World in the way that we haven't really seen before.
Yeah.
From PvP sandbox to PvE theme park.
Yeah.
Something game director Scott Lane confirmed in one of the developer chats that were released. With Crucible shut down already, AGS was 2 for 3 on failed games, with New World not even launched yet but already suffering from immense issues. A lot was riding on New World being a success, which was originally set to launch May 2020, but then delayed significantly following the PvP changes and the feedback received from testers all the way to spring 2021. AGS would express a desire to add more features and content, including more middle and in-game experiences, because there just weren't any. Sandbox games don't typically need them as much because the players can flesh that content out themselves. This would give New World roughly a year to shift their game to a more PvE-centric MMO, which arguably wouldn't be enough time. To elaborate, another large non-ignorable issue with switching to a PvE-centric typical MMO in-game content model design style, that's a mouthful, is that it's one that's not particularly long-lasting. Think of in-game raids and dungeons. After you've completed them a few times, you don't really have a reason.
That is one of the biggest complaints that I have with the theme park model when it comes down to it. It requires such a massive amount of content that developers, even with like almost, you could even seem, or just assume an unlimited budget and time, can't even like make enough content for people to consume. That's why I think kind of the future of the MMO is going to be what is called the sand park. It's the sandbox and the theme park married in different ways. And I think a lot of that ends up being with what I actually appreciate about New World is its open world and how being able to take part in that and then eventually kind of jump off into content. My fear for New World is it just follows suit with every other theme park based MMO and becomes so very driven into instance content, which while has its strengths, hopefully doesn't become the be all end all. So you don't end up having this beautiful world that you can explore and there's danger and there's bosses and there's things to do in being completely replaced by instance content where you're just kind of seeing a handful of the same people each and every day. But we'll have to wait and see. Time will tell.
Reason to redo them. The shelf life on that sort of content is very short, and thus it's a bit of a perishable good. Think of the sandbox MMO as more of non-perishable goods, because the players can constantly create their own content, thus it's long-lasting. New World suddenly shifting from a sandbox-style game to a more theme park-style game wasn't exactly an easy switch. Theme park content is quite competitive and extremely expensive, but my hypothesis on it is that it's not sustainable due to design. It's very hard to do sustainably with the constant drive for more content and bigger and better content. In fact, the only developers who have done it realistically are pretty much the biggest developers in the space, because they can afford it. New World was going to struggle to just walk into an entirely new, different game direction and compete with the likes of Square Enix, ZeniMax Online, ArenaNet, and even Jagex.
That's actually where I would say that New World's doing pretty dadgum well. Like when you actually look at the games that had come out, like New World was launching without nostalgia as a game stepping into this against Endwalker, against Guild Wars 2, against World of Warcraft, against ESO, against Destiny 2, against Elden Ring, so it's like there was just all these massive games that were just waiting and ready to take. And then obviously with the issues in the launch with the bugs, clearly had an impact on people just getting frustrated and choosing to walk away. And I said this actually, Justin, back in the day, it's always going to be about the question of how does New World invite them back into the game itself? And so that's what I'm honestly waiting for. Now, I personally really absolutely love New World. Like, I'm having a great time playing this game. I enjoy playing it. I enjoy streaming it. I'm going to continue to do so in hopes that also that Amazon continues to support it. Like, ultimately what we're looking at is a series of trying to build trust with AGS. Who are they? I think them also continuing to work on other MMORPGs will be the kind of the real kicker here, because especially if they want people to believe that they'll continue to support the like other future games, it's all about like showing us. It's their actions speak louder than any promises or any roadmap can. And so one of the things that I'm enjoying watching right now is the development of the game itself, and hopes that we'll see kind of bigger future plans in and of itself coming down the pipe. All that being said, long story short, with that that cut in right there, is that I think honestly that the fact that it's maintained the players that it has, even against the big players who've already got established games that have already been out for 10 plus years, that have plenty of content and can easily add in more content much easier, much quicker, because they've already kind of worked out the core of what their game is. That's a huge plus in my mind. Now, the question is that will players come back and be willing to give Amazon another shot when I would assume an expansion would be the most logical time to kind of have that, because you get the marketing push, you get people coming back to check out the game even before the expansion goes live to see what's all changed with it. Then you get the expansion with whatever that would end up bringing. That's essentially, I think, kind of the real test, the real litmus test, assuming or, hoping that actually does come to pass.
After taking a year off to refocus the game, the start of 2021 wasn't any kinder to Amazon Game Studios, as the company would be plagued with reports of severe dysfunction within the studio amidst the shift in design. Surely New World had immense pressure on it, with 2 of the 3 gaming efforts of AGS already being major failures, and outlets like Bloomberg questioning if they could even make a good game in the first place. While Amazon is pouring $500 million into video game development, not only are there calls of dysfunction, there's also accusations of toxic bro culture concerning Amazon Game Studios too. It felt like Amazon's desire to skip through the process a bit by buying its way through, they had seemingly picked wrongly in their leadership. For starters, they didn't even pick a leader with gaming experience. You heard that right. Mike Frazzini, the leader of the games division at the time, hadn't even made a game before. According to a Bloomberg report, Frazzini would reportedly frustrate developers with basic takes and had trouble differentiating between gameplay and concept footage. But that's not the worst of it. Sure, upper leadership guy without hands-on experience and being out of touch isn't the craziest thing. Head of games department or not, right? I think. The worst of it is when you start to peek into the portfolios and experience of the other experienced game developers tasked on Amazon's new MMORPG New World. Let's start with the game director featured quite prominently, Scott Lane. Scott was a producer who worked on wrestling games, shooters, and a few top RPGs. Not online RPGs or MMOs in sight though. Well, that's fine, he's a producer. What about the actual developers, right? Well, the design lead worked on Killer Instinct and Silent Hill Homecoming. The combat lead had a similar history because, well, Amazon acquired Double Helix, and these are Double Helix developers. Well, that's fine. If they have someone experienced as a game's systems leader, they could just teach the other developers how the systems work. Gears of War? And the dude's primarily an artist? For a systems designer? At this point, I started to just dig deeper out of curiosity, and a deep growing sadness sinking within. The UX lead was a Madden developer. The world lead was about the only guy with MMO experience. Just too bad it was a failed MMO, Defiance. The narrative leader? No other credits. Even the AI lead has a lacking position, with a developer who was previously a character designer. Now, my intention is not to announce all of these developers are just incapable of offering good perspectives, or they suck, or whatever else. My point is that why would you pump this much money into video game development for one of the most ambitious games in game development, and then hire essentially nobody with actual MMO experience? It's like if
I would have to say, like, I personally don't have any faults in any of the people's like past work, namely speaking, because it doesn't necessarily share what kind of games they've played. But when a job's a job at the end of the day, like when you're just like, especially trying to get into the industry. What I would say though is that based off of just everything that has already been shared in this video, I would say that what you've probably seen is that New World started off with a certain kind of design. We've seen that design shift over and over again, especially with the sandbox kind of mindset, that certain things weren't necessarily as important, especially when it comes down to narrative. And overall, it ended up probably being like, hey, we actually have something working on Lumberyard, which I bet we're going to see here later in this video, him talk about the engine itself. And now all of a sudden became much more overall importance. I don't know. I would be curious as to you guys' thoughts on that one specifically, but we'll go ahead and move on.
I was some billionaire who entered into the phone business, but I never actually used or was familiar with industry standards in phones. You can probably assume no matter how much money I would pour into it, my phone wouldn't be competitive for a number of reasons, no matter how many flip phone companies I would acquire. And when I encountered common problems, I wouldn't know how to deal with them due to just having no experience. Alright, we can just ditch the crappy phone analogy. The point is here is that New World was being helmed by guys with no MMO experience. That's absolutely ludicrous to me on its own, because Amazon can just pay themselves out of that problem quite easily. But on top of that, I don't even know how many MMOs these devs were even playing or had played. That might sound like I'm just making a bold claim and just going a little bit too far, but I'm basing it off of a few things. For starters, I've spoken to devs, and I spoke to one that worked at SOE, and he stated that it's fairly common on MMOs for people making decisions to have no MMO experience, let alone development experience. Secondly, when I was at the AGS office, I noticed that when I made certain, in my opinion, industry standard or well-received feature remarks, and the industry, and, referenced them, the devs seemed to be quite impressed. While I take my testing job quite seriously, and of course I think highly of myself, contract pay or not, many of the things I was offering as advice and ideas for AGS were just lifted from some of my favorite MMOs like ArcAge and Star Wars Galaxies and Warhammer and even other survival games like Rust and Conan Exiles. I could be reading too much into that, but I think that the story of New World is one of a bunch of likely talented developers who think or thought they could make an MMORPG without actually learning how, or going through the process on a smaller scale. Whether that's
We've actually seen that same kind of plaguing happen with something like Anthem, for example, where like, oh, we don't talk about Destiny. Now, I'm not gathering that that's essentially kind of the message here. Oh, we don't talk about whatever, right? Because essentially MMOs are very vast. What I do find interesting and would call out is that we haven't seen MMOs really being developed at all. We've seen kind of the rise of kind of the indie crowdfunding scene, which really, in my opinion, hasn't paid out. Maybe you're having a good time with it. But all in all, like when we've seen like the last major MMO truly to launch was WildStar, and that having been shuttered down at this point. Again, WildStar, no nostalgic based foundation. I would submit that if WildStar was able to persist today with the buy to play, maybe even battle pass model, maybe it would have been a whole different story, but maybe it was just an unfortunate series of events to kind of have that game in and of itself shutter down. I'd actually love to see that game come back, and I know people are working on it privately, and maybe one day that will actually be something that you can kind of experience for yourself, but we'll continue on.
It's the fault of leadership and trusting in the wrong people, or the developers taking on something just too grand. Who knows?
I love the editing.
New World would face another delay in February of 2021, this time to August in the fall. Instead, AGS would utilize this time to close beta test New World, which isn't a bad idea. The reason we have to cover delays as a negative thing is New World was set to launch a year before. It's one thing to have a delay or two, but by the point the game is nearing years off its initial targeted launch date, which just screams that it wasn't very realistic to begin with. Closed beta in the summer was supposed to highlight what New World had in store, with their shift to a more PvE-centric theme park-style game, and all of that. What it showcased was simplistic questing that seemed to take all of 30 minutes to write and come up with, where you must go here, interact with the same objects over and over again, or do the PvP variant where you run here and then stand there for 2 minutes. I wasn't very impressed with the changes, as there would be no reason effectively to even flag for PvP anymore, and the game's lackluster PvE wasn't going to help matters either. When I say that New World and closed beta actually had lackluster PvE, what I mean is just literally. I actually enjoyed the gameplay loop itself and had a good time. I thought it was quite fun to play when the guns still shot projectiles especially. The problem is that outside of that gameplay loop, there wasn't much redeeming concerning the PvE in New World to begin with. It was below the industry standard for the time and below standards even set by MMOs back in the early 2000s. There was next to no main story, very little individual story, and the quests were nearly 22 years old feeling. Say what you will about titles like TSW, SWTOR, ESO, and Final Fantasy XIV, but they upped the level of expectation for story and PvE content in MMOs and MMORPGs.
That's 100% true. What we end up seeing, though, and I think one of the things I've been talking about is the kind of reclassification of games within the MMO umbrella, and especially when it comes down to it, like 14. I don't consider 14 an MMORPG. I've called it an RPG MMO. You could actually go on and talk about it as a co-MMO, or sorry, co-RPG, in which that it's like it's a single-player game, and then occasionally you can play with your friends if you want to. It opens up into a bigger world with more content as you progress with the story, but the story kind of is the pillar of which things are based off of. There are strengths and weaknesses when it comes down to a system like that. Like with anything else, like you have, opportunity cost in that regards. Like what do you end up focusing in on? One of the things that 14 will have an interesting problem of solving is the problem of onboarding new players in the future whenever that road enters makes the most sense. Is that 7.0? We don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But what that means is that at some point, do you have to play 2,000 hours of a game before you can actually experience the multiplayer and the social aspect? That's not going to appeal to everybody, and not that every MMO has to appeal to everybody. I think that's one of the greatest weaknesses that we've seen over the last decade in its design, is that I think MMOs really need to focus in on what makes them the strongest. Like what can they do that other games don't, where I think we've seen games like Fortnite Battle Royales actually come out and have a bigger multiplayer, massively multiplayer online approach, despite not having essentially kind of what you would typically associate with MMORPG, and being that you have, more instance 4-player, 5-player, small man style content that's more dungeon crawling and based. And so I think what would be interesting to see in the grand scheme of things is that what do MMOs do to separate themselves and establish themselves for the 2020s and forward?
New World seemed to be a regression and seems to fail in comparison in everything but visuals and the action combat offering. Meanwhile, throughout the closed beta on the nicest graphics cards, New World was literally bricking them, which is an absolutely horrible look, and to me screams not being properly optimized. As the August launch date would creep closer,
he touched on that, so I'll touch on it here, is that obviously you haven't seen that report since that happening, hitting the 3090s. The manufacturers came out and said that, oops, our bad. There was something with a soldering issue on those specific cards. So it does suck for those who got hit by that. If you are still personally concerned and wanted to check out New World, there haven't been reports of that happening, but also you can use something like GeForce Now if you want to play and you have the bandwidth of like 25 down, I think, to be able to use that service. So I actually use both local and GeForce Now because I have computers that generally can't play video games anymore because they're old, but GeForce Now, and not sponsored, enables me to actually stream and play. But that was a thing, and that was a big concern, and it did have people concerned. Whether it ends up being like, on Amazon, honestly, I would say that we've seen it happen with other games in the past, where it's like it would have probably been any game that kind of is pushing your graphics card as hard that it can go when it comes to its visuals. Because one of the things when you hear about New World, people praise its visuals, its sound, and more. I would say that it would, like any game that would have probably done that, probably would have established and probably found that same soldering issue from the manufacturers in and of itself. Anyway, that's just kind of, he touched on it, but we didn't seem to get a follow through. So hopefully that helps.
And closer, another delay would hit New World, this time a shorter month-long delay to focus on the game polish. When New World did launch though, could we trust it was really ready after all of these delays? New World would launch globally September 28th, 2021, after some time being delayed. Finally, AGS's Final Horseman was unveiled and set to try to wow the Twitch and MMORPG audience. According to Bezos and what I was told by AGS, the expectation for New World would be that it would remain a top 10 viewed title on Twitch. It was able to accomplish that temporarily at least, even managing to impressively sell a few dozen million copies according to Steam Spy. Where on Steam it was able to peak at just under 1 million players peak and 500,000 average concurrently, making the top 10 most played list. New World on aggregate review website Metacritic would score a 70 out of 100 from 35 different critics, with a slightly poorer review score from users at 5.5 out of 10, which isn't half bad at all and certainly salvageable, especially with that amount of players playing the game. PC Gamer, who gave New World a 60 out of 100, would state in closing that concerning the game, New World's engaging crafting and faction rivalries are held back by abysmal PvE and a boring world. IGN, who would score the game the same, 6 out of 10, in their review would claim, New World is a very pretty survival MMORPG hybrid that saves its best moments for the endgame, but you
and this is my personal bias as somebody who obviously likes New World, but also who likes MMORPGs. Hands down, I don't see a lot of review sites that align in terms of what it means to actually review an MMO. And so overall, like, I just don't think MMOs are as popular as people think they are. They do get headlines. They do get people's like interest because I think maybe there's some nostalgia for the genre as a whole back in the day. But at its core, like, here's where we sit, here's where we stand. And so, like, yeah, I'm not surprised when a site like reviews like an MMO, like in terms of these numbers. I think that essentially is, you know, when you start to actually kind of look at the aggregate, Final Fantasy 14 being an exception to the rule, but an exception that happened over the course of many years where that score kept going up and up and up, reestablishing and reasserting itself, and essentially just dominating in terms of what it means to be a Final Fantasy online RPG.
You have to be willing to grind like hell to get to them. Now, personally, I wouldn't trust a critical review on an MMORPG as they typically don't even play anywhere close to the amount of hours you would need to play to form a true opinion, but they also just historically are quite poor. Playing New World at launch felt actually worse than the previous installments in my eyes, because the combat and animations now felt a bit snappier and more typical MMO feeling, less Dark Souls-like, which is kind of what we all initially wanted and asked for. This would also create some undesired effects, such as the ability to make your character skate by quickly changing directions mid-movement. The reason that combat felt worse to me, though, really had to do with the fact that they shifted to hit scan over projectiles for performance issues. This made shooting a gun feel far less consistent with the setting and less easy to aim. Now, I'm a big proponent of hit scan in maybe a super competitive game, but when you're shooting a gun that actually has a projectile that actually takes time to travel there, why not just use the projectile? In my opinion, it really ruined the tempo of the gunplay in New World, which was some of the best, I think, in an MMORPG period. Still, despite these issues, New World had quite a strong start out of the gate. But as I always urge, and have urged historically, caution with rocket-like launches.
Always.
An MMORPG is built on longevity, so the game doing well the first month is important to get some eyes on it, and to get some money in the developers' pockets so they can afford things, but it's not as important as doing well in a year. New World's last-minute shift to PvE-centric MMO wasn't going to hold up well compared to titles like World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy, and Elder Scrolls Online.
Exactly. And one of the things that I believe I stated in maybe even the same podcast with Justin, literally I was like, they have now, when the game launches, anywhere from 3 to 4 months of like content of things that people are going to do and consume. And the numbers in terms of the player base, I think, reflect that. As people hit level 60, as people do the content, and then as people wait for more content, there isn't a big appeal. Even when they launched the M Plus system, I was like, that's serving a small player base. I don't think that's going to drive a lot of people into it, and it clearly didn't. But it's important that it exists as a piece of content, especially as a piece of content that goes forward once established. Would it have been better with the Gypsum system and the Mutator system at launch? Hands down, absolutely. I think one of the things that a lot of people, when they hit that end game and what used to be the high watermark system but is now the Gypsum expertise system, by far that system in and of itself is way better.
So while it might grab the initial player base, I was hesitant in thinking it would keep them for very long due to lacking the name recognition and the story focus as the other titles previously mentioned.
Also, one of the things we're seeing, especially across the industry in terms of MMORPGs, is that they've also shifted that seasonal model, that seasonal mindset of the game comes out, and then essentially people play it, and then they go on break. In fact, you actually see that same kind of model apply across the games themselves, and the only thing difference in terms of that seasonal model where numbers will be different is that you're looking at established games with established communities, and then everybody kind of has their own way. People are coming back to Final Fantasy XIV right now, having taken a year off, and meaning that they now are going to be playing through Endwalker and things like that. So overall, people still kind of have this, kind of very cycle where they go in and play other games, and that actually is very healthy and important I think for this genre as a whole, something that I think Yoshi P has established when it comes down to it. While there's still, I think, in some MMO players looking for that home, that place where they live, and that's the only game that they play. I think overall what you're seeing in terms of kind of the community is that it is more fluid, and I think part of that actually is the buy to play model without the subscription versus something that locks you in and you're paying every month. And whether that's a good or a bad thing, we can always discuss,
Within a month, those dreamy player counts were in a sharp decline, being reported on by even Forbes.
Every game.
Down 62% to 357,000 players peak. AGS was even trying to give away copies for free in some people's eyes as a way to just keep the player counts up. Besides reasons already covered, why was New World losing population so quickly? Well, simply put, the grind put forth didn't feel worth it for most players. There wasn't enough endgame, and once you got to the endgame anyway, it just wasn't good enough, not compared to competitors. And AGS was sadly going to be incentivized from a progression standpoint to just slow progression from launch onward, which doesn't sound too crazy if that progression wasn't the same copy-paste quests and chests and some points of interest scattered about. The worst part is they didn't even have the guts to do this publicly. They chose to stealthily nerf progression during their first major update instead. AGS trying to address the PvP issues I and many others, I am sure, outlined early on after launch seemed just a too little too late thing. We already knew that people wouldn't PvP because there just wasn't a reason to, and we could have predicted this not because of a crystal ball but because of paying attention to other MMOs that have launched and studying their systems and audience reception to such. But New World felt like an MMORPG created just in a vacuum, with absolutely no market research done. And you can't just fix that with a few content patches.
I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know if I agree with that at all.
With the population down yet again, this time by December 2021 to 145,000 peak players, AGS was forced to merge some of their servers in New World already. They would then merge again later in the same month, and while merges aren't proof that the game is going to be shuttered, they aren't really a good sign so early on. New World unmistakably was at a low
The problem with that, though, like if you were going to sit in here, and one of the things when it comes down to kind of the negative perception of that, it's called the MMO death spiral, is that, things are getting slower, I don't want to invest. It's all about trust. Like at the end of the day, like if you trust that the game is going to be there in a year, you're more likely to play it today than you would if you didn't feel like the game's going to exist in a year. And that's the death spiral, right? So you don't play because you don't feel like that's going to be. So other people are like, well, maybe I'm not going to stick around. That's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it's really up to the publisher, the developer, to continue to establish, to assert, and to develop that trust. AKA, I still believe that an expansion is literally the best play, the best call for the game and the game's future long term, because it says, hey, we're in it. And I would say that as soon as they announce an expansion, they should literally announce the next expansion. That way it's like, yep, the expansion's whenever that is. And then, by the way, we're already starting to work on the next expansion, so that when people are like, well, is the game going to stick around? We're like, well, we're getting an expansion. We're getting another one too. So we know that we have that roadmap, etc. I think that ultimately here is, at its important. Now, with the explosive growth and the servers and how the game is structured, like server mergers was always going to happen, and the fact that it needed to happen much sooner than it did, I think that's one of the things that actually ultimately hurt the player base, along with the world transfer token. So when you say was the game ready for launch? No, it needed to have player transfers, it needed to have the server mergers and all that system implemented, ready to rock and roll as quickly and as soon as possible. So at its core, we have them now, but again, it's going to shift into, is the game ready? Is it established? Is it ready to do what it needs to do in the long term? And that's the only thing we have to do is wait for that. Thank you. Coffee delivery. All right, let's continue.
Player count. Some servers were down to just a few mere 100 players, even after the merges. Within 2 more months, the population would dip to 67,000 players by February of 2022. A month later, and the former studio head of Amazon Game Studios, Mike Frazzini, would leave the company, citing a desire to spend more time with his family. Now, Mike Frazzini was a bit of a lightning rod of Amazon Game Studios, but rightfully so, as the head of the studio having no prior game experience. Largely, gaming for Amazon has been an abject failure. They're able to get initial successes, like with New World and Lost Ark, but within a few months, their populations drop down significantly.
That, like, using that as a point, like, just to kind of highlight, I don't support, I don't agree with that at all. That is the MMO. Like, it is the exception, or the utopian MMO that doesn't do that doesn't exist. And this is the same across the board. In fact, even World of Warcraft suffered right out of the gate. The thing that World of Warcraft did was it actually opened the MMO genre to an entire new audience of people who hadn't played those games before. And that essentially kind of was obviously the counterbalance to it. That has happened. That is not going to be something that we see ever happening in its lifetime. And looking and trying to judge MMOs based off of something that doesn't exist, I think only holds this genre back in and of itself. And so when we look at the numbers at its core, like even right now, again, looking at the multipliers and doing the numbers, you're looking at around 407,000 players playing New World at its moment. Not all at the same time, which, yes, concurrent players do have an impact, but it's not as great as what I feel people kind of put the weight in on it. But I've preached that before. I'll continue to preach that until the end of time, or I can't speak anymore. Whatever comes first.
Would announce their first big content update in the end of March, set for sometime soon in the summer. The changes are set to bring a new weapon, more story quests, and content to the game. But the problem with the content update, besides it being a rather lean offering, is that, well, what I discussed earlier regarding perishable versus non-perishable goods. Because AGS pivoted New World towards a more perishable style of content, which isn't necessarily bad, it's just not sustainable by design. They were inherently going to be very reliant on content updates to succeed. This would put New World in a difficult position, as population has continued to shrink down now to 34,000 players peak, over 90% of the population dropped at this point, and as less players play the game, AGS will likely have to put less money and time into the updates, which kind of creates that self-fulfilling prophecy. New World is on the ropes, and even if you're a fan, you can't deny that losing over 90% of the population from launch isn't good. And with lean content offerings on the horizon, there's not much to be optimistic about the future of New World either. And I'm ready to put my name on it. I don't trust the developers much to salvage the product either, when most...
That's, I think, the key word in the video itself. He doesn't trust the developers to do it. And should you? I don't know. Like, nobody really does, because trust is something that's established with time. Yoshi P with 14 had to rebuild the trust within Square Enix. They lost it. In fact, some things that the CEO currently states has people lose the trust in Square Enix as a whole, but trusts in maybe a certain division within the company. So trust isn't something that I think you should just have blindly for AGS, but I think as an MMO fan, it's good to have hope, and it's good to sit here and hope that they can turn it around. And one of the things that when it comes down to what I look at and judge is that, again, that communication, the consistency, and content. In terms of communication, I feel like the devs are listening, they're communicating, and they're implementing the feedback, and I think that's good. I think that's what you want, and that's actually something I enjoy about the MMO experience overall, and I think it's something that we should applaud as gamers, especially if we're enjoying the game, which I am at this moment. But note that I'm not going to sit here and say that you absolutely have to enjoy the game at this moment. But anyway, I think it's coming, like he hit the nail on the head in terms of that he doesn't trust him, and that's why he's ready to put his name on it. I honestly feel like, based off what they showed me, they continue to live, and I'm going to continue to root for him, because I think as an MMO player, New World's success benefits the genre more than its failure.
Most of the game's updates thus far are just focusing on fixing the game that they launched. They haven't even had time to actually add something really new.
I think he said that the Heart of Madness, and he says that's come out in the summer. That's actually not true. That came out actually in March. The summer update's going to have a brand new event, new dungeon, even like kind of a group finder, and then essentially like in the fall, a whole new zone and more. So like, we're getting a big update here in the next week or two, and then we're also going to get some bigger summer updates and bigger fall updates. But yes, I do think that a big content drop is going to be the key aspect to it.
New or innovative in the game, because they're too busy fixing half-baked systems. Systems I frankly speaking don't have much faith of them delivering on. With too much of the sand out of New World for it to exist on its own, with slow or meager content updates, I believe it's on a further path towards its demise. That's the Music Detectives' final deduction time. Let's take the gathered clues and evidence and outline the largest contributing factors behind the death of a game, New World. AGS lacked proper MMO experience and developers. 180 to their game design during closed beta. Content design and offering has no longevity and it isn't competitive. Offers nothing innovative nor otherworldly worthy of the Amazon name. Hobbled too early to a launch. Displayed a severe lack of market and competitor research. It feels like it was just made in a vacuum. Now, the whole being made in a vacuum thing is honestly pretty bad, but the worst part about New World to me is the sheer scale of the failure. Hundreds of millions potentially, and yet the lack of market research is just appalling once you put it into perspective. How can you put that much money into an industry and not even hire the experts in what you're creating? Why not take the Eastern developer approach like Yoshi P or Yuji Naka did? Choose a few prominent online RPGs and just play the hell out of them as a team and study them. If you don't have MMO experience like they didn't, at least be open to experiencing it.
Like, honestly, at the end of the day, like, I feel like that is a little bit reaching, because in terms of developers, like, he's looking at their history, it doesn't necessarily equate to that they haven't played an MMO. And honestly, if that is true, and then they completely built it in a vacuum with like blindfolds in this regards, for me speaking as somebody who's really enjoying the game, that's effing impressive. Like what they ended up creating. Now, I think one of the things that's held the game back is its shift over the course of time. Whereas if you have kind of a clear vision of exactly what you want to build, maybe again from somebody who is like, I really want to make this game, and this is the team that's going to do it, and we're going to stick it through, and we're going to like really have that cohesive experience and that vision. I think that would be obviously a different story, different timeline. That's why I'm actually the most excited about Final Fantasy 16. It feels like it's probably the most cohesive Square Enix project that has been started and should be completing soon, to date in the longest run, at least in the last 10 years. And so like, I would counter what he just said with actually, I don't see that. I don't see those points that he's getting at. Not that he's wrong, but it's just, I actually would just disagree with what he just said.
But when are developers and bigwigs going to realize that video game developers isn't the same as an MMORPG video game developer? MMORPGs are the most complex genre for a reason. They actually simulate worlds. They have world persistence, massive amounts of players playing them and playing them simultaneously, and do things on a massive scale. This is far more complex than just a game with a guild system or a friends list. When Amazon comes into the space ignoring the rules and lessons learned by other MMORPGs, it's a painful but important lesson that no matter how big and powerful you are, you can't skip Go. You can't skip the process without paying your due diligence. And if you can't hire experienced MMO developers as they can kind of be unicorns, at least hire some developers who passionately play MMOs, or consult with people who do, and actually listen. Thanks for watching, guys.
See, I would counter all that with that's exactly what they did. They brought y'all in and consulted, and some of the feedback that y'all gave like definitely was implemented. In fact, even the delays, I think, highlight that and show that. So now at its core, like when we talk with Justin, like when we had him on the podcast, honestly, just awesome guy. So I don't feel like any of what I'm saying is just dunking on him. Like I have a massive amount of respect for what his work is, also his view. Now we actually, Justin and I agree a lot on Sandbox in terms of what MMORPGs exist. But one of the things I see within the genre of MMOs from MMO players ends up being the struggle with how you, like I said, it's almost you have to sub-genre out the system in the games due to the fact that at the end of the day, like the MMO of today, the theme park isn't the same game. It isn't even like, it should be its own genre as something like you would see with Final Fantasy 11 or ESO or games like that, or even EVE Online, that sandbox player-driven experience. And I think Sandbox actually is the better version of it, but it's the smaller version. Like when we look at player numbers, and then the question is it a smaller version in terms of like player population? And yes, you have millions of characters, but you'll end up seeing usually around 100 to 200,000, maybe 400,000 active players. And so that's where essentially I think kind of the numbers game becomes a detriment to the overall experience for the game itself. And ultimately, I hope that we can get to a point in this all where it comes down to it is legitimately focusing around the player base and player population. Anyway, guys, that is my time today. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I know this was a long one, a big reaction. Again, link pinned. Do that stuff. Go make sure you watch the original if you haven't seen it. Looking forward to your comments, and especially as these react videos kind of come back to the channel. And hopefully you guys have a wonderful day. And hopefully I'll see you in my next video. But until then, take care.
Yeah. It's time to chill out on the couch and read some comments. That's right. You know me when it comes to Destiny. I'm off with the clan, and I'm glad you're feeling better. Oh yeah.